Hello and welcome back. So this week we are talking about paraphrasing and quoting. So these are skills that really go along with summarizing. We were talking about summaries last week and how they're just really valuable when it comes to working with our sources. We need to be able to summarize our sources both for ourselves and ultimately for our readers. Because, of course, if we can summarize successfully, that means that we understand our source, we have a good handle on it, we're capable of explaining it potentially to others, and then that's going to come in handy later on some of our future work, especially the research paper. We're not always going to have to summarize at length in the research paper, but sometimes we will need to provide brief summaries, and even if we're not including a lot of summaries in the paper, we are still drawing upon our knowledge of the sources, and a lot of that knowledge has been recorded, written down in the form of notes and summaries. So hopefully we can see the value of summarizing, even if it does sometimes seem like an elementary kind of exercise. So now that we've kind of gotten a good grip on summaries, I want us to tackle paraphrasing and quoting because, like I said, these are all related skills. You're often using all of these skills together when you're working with sources. So we'll start with paraphrasing because it is sort of like the cousin of summarizing. Sometimes these terms get used interchangeably, and sometimes people think they mean the same thing, but actually they do not. They are similar in some ways, but summarizing and paraphrasing are a bit different. So let's talk about some of those differences, and let's just write down a basic definition for what a paraphrase is. So a paraphrase is a restatement of a text's main ideas using your own words. So we see one similarity right away between a paraphrase and a summary. Both of them will be written in your own words. So you're trying to capture the ideas expressed by the author of your source, but to do that, you use your own language. Okay, but the way that a paraphrase differs from a summary is the fact that you are not condensing now. Remember, with a summary, we were condensing, we were shortening, we were taking a large section of text and sort of shrinking it down, reducing it to only the most important points, the most important ideas. So that meant we had to cut a lot out. When we were summarizing, we had to cut a lot of material out because we did not have space for it. Now, a paraphrase is different because when you paraphrase, you are not cutting, you are not condensing, you are not altering the length. Okay, so you're still using your own words, but when you paraphrase a passage from a text, your paraphrase should be roughly the same length as the original passage in your source text. So we're no longer condensing, we're still using our own words, we're still focusing on big ideas and important points, but typically when we paraphrase, we select smaller sections of text. So I think we've already seen, when we summarize, we're often summarizing entire articles or entire book chapters. So it's pretty obvious that we need to condense and shorten the length. Otherwise, we're going to end up writing an entire article or an entire book chapter. We don't want that. But when we paraphrase, we're not going to paraphrase an entire article. We don't typically paraphrase something that long. We're often going to paraphrase a sentence or maybe a couple of sentences from our source text, from the article or book chapter that we're using. In a few cases, we might end up paraphrasing entire paragraphs. That's not unheard of, but we're not going to paraphrase a 10-page article because, of course, our paraphrase is going to be roughly the same length as the article. So just keep that in mind. We typically summarize entire texts, whereas we want to paraphrase smaller passages within those texts. So that could mean a sentence or two, maybe a paragraph or two at the absolute max. Okay, so once again, paraphrases are in your voice, your language, but now we're not going to alter the structure of the original text. We're not going to alter the length, and we're not going to cut stuff out. So if we want to paraphrase a sentence, we don't want to cut anything out of that sentence. We want to create an accurate restatement of that sentence using our own words, but we're not shortening, we're not changing the structure, and just like a summary, we're not adding anything of our own. So remember that as well. Just like a summary, when we paraphrase, we're not providing our own opinions yet. We're not really sharing our own personal views or our own personal experiences. We are just sticking to the text in the source, trying to accurately restate it. Okay, so I thought one thing that might be helpful, just as an example, I included sort of an example in this week's material so we can see what a paraphrase looks like. So I want you guys to take a look. This is just a page I took out of a textbook, but we have two columns in the document, and on one side we see the original passage, from a source that we might want to paraphrase, and then on the right-hand side we see the actual paraphrase. So we can sort of track how this work gets done. And they've color-coded the passages. I'm not sure how clearly the color coding shows up in your in the PDF. But if you take a look at the original passage, you can see how the student is paraphrasing each individual sentence within that passage. So this might be just sort of a useful exercise, a way to kind of see this type of work in action. And again, one way that you might think about a paraphrase is to sort of consider it like a translation. We talked about this a little bit with summarizing, but I think it's an even more accurate description of what you do when you paraphrase. You really are translating the original passage into your own language. So we typically want to do this with difficult source material, with difficult articles or book chapters that contain sort of advanced or specialized language, words or phrases that maybe we had to look up, maybe we weren't initially familiar with what that stuff meant. So a lot of times what you're doing when you paraphrase is you're just taking those ideas, again, not altering the length or the structure of the ideas or the statements, but you're just taking that stuff and putting it into your own words that are easier to understand. You can rearrange, a few, the order of a few things in order to create a sentence that just is more clear for you, more direct, and it might also be more clear for your readers. So we can see examples of that in the document. So let's just start with the first sentence in the original passage that we are paraphrasing. Let's just take a look. When you first arrive on these shores, you are in mourning. Okay, so that's a pretty short sentence, and it's somewhat simple in terms of its structure, but you might notice that we don't really know what the author is referring to. Now, of course, if we've read the entire source, which we should have done by this point if we are paraphrasing it, we probably have some idea of what the author is discussing in this first sentence. But when taken alone, when taken in isolation, that first sentence of the passage is a little bit unclear. It might not be unclear to you, the student who's working with the source, but that passage might be a little bit unclear to your readers if you try to present it as it was originally written. So let's paraphrase it. And what you notice is that in the student's paraphrase of that first sentence, we actually end up with two sentences. So it takes the student two original sentences of their own to successfully paraphrase the first sentence of the original passage. And that's pretty typical, especially if you want to simplify, use easier language. Sometimes that results in slightly longer sentences because you're kind of explaining some things both for yourself and potentially for your readers. So remember, we don't want to make substantial alterations to length. But if you end up with one more sentence in your paraphrase than what you had in the original text, that's okay. If you're one sentence short or one sentence over the actual length of the original, that's okay. Those aren't major alterations. You can add a sentence, cut a sentence, but you want your length to be roughly the same as the original length. So let's take a look at what the student does to paraphrase that first sentence of the source. So this is what the student is saying. So notice the difference in language. New immigrants to America feel the loss of their friends, family, and culture. Period. Now we go on to the next sentence. Codrescu, that's the author of the original source, compares this sense of loss to mourning a death. Okay, so let's notice why we have a little bit more verbiage now. Why we needed to write two sentences in order to paraphrase one. What the student's really doing is explaining in a little bit more detail the idea that we see in that original source text. So again, in the original, the author is just telling us when you arrive, sort of putting the reader in the position of the subject. And Codrescu, the author, is just saying when you arrive, you're in mourning. But it's not immediately clear in that sentence who you are or why you are in mourning. Now again, it might be clear if you've read the entire source, if you've read the entire article, but your readers will not have done that. So we need to simplify, clarify, use easier language. And that's what the student is doing. He's being more clear and specific. Instead of saying you when you arrive, he says when new immigrants to America arrive. New immigrants to America, getting more specific. And now we're learning more about why they're in mourning or what exactly it is that they are mourning. He points it out in more detail in his paraphrase, right? They're feeling the loss of their friends, their family, and their culture. So that's a level of specificity that we don't get in the original. But notice that the student is not changing the meaning. He's not changing what Codrescu is actually saying. He's just making it easier to understand. And then he goes on in that second sentence to reference the author by name. That's always a good idea when you are summarizing or paraphrasing, right? He specifically references the author, and then he says Codrescu compares this sense of loss to mourning a death. So again, just being more clear about what Codrescu means, right? Making clear the kind of metaphor or comparison that Codrescu is making in that first sentence. So yes, we have to write an additional sentence, but we still haven't altered the length in a really substantial way. Okay, and now we're just making the meaning more clear because we're making the language more clear. Okay, so let's move on to the second sentence of the original. The only consolations are these products, which had been imbued with religious significance back at home. Period. Okay, again, that sentence, when taken sort of out of context, when it's taken out of the context of the rest of the article, that particular sentence doesn't immediately make a whole lot of sense. The only consolations are these products. What products? Again, Codrescu, the author, assumes that we know, and the student obviously knows because the student is very familiar with this source. But I don't know what Codrescu means when the author says these products. What products? Maybe they're listed elsewhere in the original text, but they're not here in this particular passage. So again, a little bit of a lack of clarity for somebody who isn't familiar with the source. So the student is going to create a paraphrase that's more clear. So look at the student's version of that sentence I just read. To console themselves, They, of course, meaning the immigrants, we know that now, they turned to material objects such as cars, furniture, and things that they could not buy in the old country. So now, again, we're getting a higher level of specificity. Now the student is actually mentioning examples of the types of products that Codrescu mentions. So now we're just learning more about what those products are. Cars, furniture, and other stuff they couldn't buy back in their homelands. Okay, so again, we're not changing the meaning. We're just adding a little bit more detail. So yes, the sentence that we write as our paraphrase, the paraphrase that the student is writing, it ends up being a little bit longer than the original sentence, but not a whole lot longer. And the meaning, the basic idea behind the sentence remains the same. And again, notice the student isn't editorializing. The student isn't saying, and I think Codrescu's crazy to say that. There's no personal opinion, right? We're not really evaluating or analyzing the source yet. We are just restating its big ideas using our own language. So we can keep going. We don't have to go through the entire thing. But let's just maybe check out the third sentence of the original, which starts with, but when these things turn out not to be the real things, you begin to experience a second death brought about by betrayal. Again, if we're just reading Codrescu, this passage from Codrescu without knowing the rest of the source, that sentence doesn't immediately make sense. When these things turn out not to be the real things, what does that mean? What's real? You, once again, Codrescu is sort of addressing the reader like they're the immigrants in question. You begin to experience a second death brought about by betrayal. That's not immediately clear. So the student, to paraphrase that, writes the following. But the immigrant discovers, sadly, that the products that we were just talking about in the previous sentence, those cars, the furniture, whatever, the products are cheap and shoddily made. Okay, so again, a little more specificity. Maybe the student's even pulling a little bit of that from somewhere else in Codrescu's article, but it's just more clear than it is in the original, right? Codrescu's being kind of vague. The student is getting more specific by naming stuff, by providing examples. But again, the point is the same. The immigrant discovers, sadly, that the products are cheap and shoddily made, period. Okay, now we're going to add another sentence just to drive home Codrescu's meaning. This discovery that the stuff sucks is a second loss, as the immigrant mourns the loss of hope. So just notice some of the changes to word choice. It's kind of interesting to notice this. So the student replaces the word betrayal and the phrase second death, which is kind of weird, and they use more familiar language. They just call it a loss. Not a death, not a betrayal, not words that might raise questions or slightly confuse us, but just a loss. You've lost something. What have you lost? The loss is the loss of hope. Really, it's the loss of certain expectations or things that you were expecting when you came to the country. So again, the student's making that clear. The discovery is a loss. It's a second loss. It's a loss of hope. We've already learned about the previous loss. That's losing your culture, your friends, your family. Now you're losing something else. You're losing hope. Okay, so that's the same meaning that Codrescu is expressing, but the student is just expressing it in more common language. It's a little easier, a little bit more straightforward, and a little bit more clear in the paraphrase. So if you just look at the two passages side by side, you'll notice that we end up in our paraphrase, we end up with about 3 additional lines, maybe 1 or 2, ultimately a couple of additional sentences, and about 3 additional lines. So that's not a substantial change to the length. So this is a good paraphrase. We're using our own language to restate the key ideas of the author. And in the process, we're translating. We're taking the difficult language of the author and we're making it easier to understand because it's in our own words, our own language. So hopefully that makes sense. And you guys can start practicing a little bit once you start to find sources. Once you receive stuff from me, once you're starting to gather some sources, you can practice paraphrasing individual sentences or maybe a handful of sentences that seem important. Stuff that seems important to the overall argument of the source. You can start paraphrasing some of those individual sentences just to kind of get a feel for how this works. I actually went back to the articles that we were looking at. I believe it was in week 3. One of those articles was an academic journal article about like wildfires and stuff going on in Nevada. Written by scientists. Some of you might have read that one, but I just went back and took a look and pulled a sentence from that article kind of at random, just as an example of the difficult language that we encounter in that particular article, because it's written by scientists. There's a lot of, information densely packed in there. There's also a lot of specialized language that we might want to translate. So I just found a sentence that I thought would be a good candidate for a paraphrase. And here's what I found. The shell core model for aerosol light absorption and scattering was used to explore the parameter space of AEA relevant to observations. Okay, so that sentence might not make a lot of sense to readers who aren't familiar with the article. Shell core model, aerosol light absorption and scattering, parameter space, AEA, some acronym that many people won't be familiar with. It's a difficult sentence, so that would be the type of sentence that you could paraphrase. Don't dramatically alter the length, don't change the meaning, but just change some of the words. Replace some of those difficult, highly specialized words with more familiar words, more common words, words that most people know and will recognize. And you see, in the process of doing this, not only is it good for your readers, it's good for you, but it's also good for your credibility. Summarizing and paraphrasing successfully both kind of bolster your credibility because you're showing your knowledge of the sources. You're showing how comfortable with them you are, how familiar you are. And again, if you can translate stuff, take difficult, complex ideas and express them in your own words, that just shows people that you know what you're talking about. And you know so well that you're now in a position to help other people to understand as well. And that usually makes you look pretty good. So paraphrasing is important, and it's just one of these skills that we need to practice and get comfortable with before the research paper. All right, so let's move on to direct quotes now. This is another really important skill, and it's pretty difficult if you haven't done it very much in the past. So providing correct, clear, direct quotations is a little bit of an art. That's how I think of it. It's not a natural skill. We are not born with this skill. We really have to practice it. And frankly, we don't always practice it very much at the lower levels of school. You don't always get a lot of chances to do direct quotations in earlier grades, or maybe you do, and just nobody really tells you how to do it correctly. But at this level, quoting correctly is important. It's a nice strategy to use. It's a nice tool for you to utilize in your research papers. It's nice to provide some direct quotations, especially from experts or eyewitnesses, stuff that's going to be powerful, effective, stuff that you might be able to use as evidence, stuff that can support your own ideas. So quotes, when chosen for the right reasons, can be really beneficial. They can really help you to build and support your argument. But before we get into the mechanics of quoting, I just want to talk about some of the reasons why you should quote. Because sometimes students quote to an unnecessary degree. We like quotes, they're good, and I'm going to require that we have at least a couple of direct quotes in our final papers. But we don't want to overquote. We don't want to quote too much. And we don't want to just quote stuff at random. We really only want to quote when those quotes are helping us or doing things for us. So the best reasons to select something to quote is, often for support, for emphasis. If you find a sentence or a phrase or maybe a couple of sentences in your source that just really tie in directly with a larger point that you're making, or they just provide support for one of your claims or ideas, that can be a good reason to pick something. If the quote supports your position and some of your ideas, you might want to use it as evidence. And oftentimes, these will be appeal to authorities. These will be expert opinions. I've used that phrase before when we were talking about testimonials and how oftentimes testimonials are the words of experts. Not always. Sometimes testimonials can be everyday people who have some relevant experience or knowledge of the topic. So either way, right? Maybe you want expert opinion. That can be good evidence. But also eyewitness accounts or personal experiences of people who have direct connections to the topic. That can sometimes be good evidence too. So if you want to use quotes as evidence, quotes to support you and support your ideas, that's usually a pretty good idea or a pretty good thing to do. But when it comes to making these choices, you kind of have to ask yourself, is the author making this statement or expressing this idea better than I could? You should always ask yourself that. Does this sound better than I could ever make it sound on my own? And if the answer is yes, it sounds better here than it would sound in an original sentence of my own, then that might be a good candidate for a direct quotation. If it's just a really powerful statement, it just really makes a strong impression, it sounds good, it sounds impressive, and you don't think you can improve upon it, then yeah, go ahead and quote it. But if you like the idea, if you like the thought, the concept, but maybe the sentence that it's expressed in is a little bit hard to understand, it's a little bit difficult, kind of like the Codrescu or the science article, but you like the idea, you want to express the idea, but you feel like the language in that original sentence is a little bit hard, a little bit strange. See, that's a better candidate than for a paraphrase. If you feel like you could say it more clearly, not necessarily better, but just more clearly, you could present it in a more straightforward fashion, using more common language, then maybe that's what you should do. Maybe that sentence would be better served to be paraphrased. Use your own language, but express the idea. So really, you quote when the quote sounds better than your language. You paraphrase or summarize when you think that your language would be more effective than the original language in the source. So that's a good way to make some of these decisions. Okay, so you can always quote for support, but you can also quote for a couple of other reasons. One thing that you might have to do at times, that kind of depends on your topic, but in some cases you might have to quote certain language, like certain jargon or like specialized vocabulary. Sometimes we want to translate that stuff into more common language, but in other cases you might have to explain what certain words or terms mean. This happens a lot with science-related topics, stuff related to technology or medicine, and really a lot of different academic disciplines have their own vocabulary. They have their own sort of specialized language. And again, you have to use your judgment. Sometimes you just want to translate that stuff and just make it easier. But if there's a word or like a procedure or a particular idea that keeps showing up in your sources, it's going to show up in your paper, it's just really important for your overall topic, you'd have to probably explain some of those. In some cases, we have to explain jargon. Or we have to explain what a specialized term means. So in those cases, it might be useful to quote some of the exact language, and then you might want to explain it or talk about it a little bit more at length. And then in some cases, depending on the academic field, there are some specialized terms that just don't really have a synonym. There's really no equivalent term that you could use in your translation. So again, in some cases, you'll just have to use the jargon and say, this is a word commonly used in medicine, and here's what it means for the lay people, for the laymen who might not recognize it. So sometimes you have to quote in order to do that. And then finally, the third reason why you might want to directly quote an author is when you are responding to your opponents. We haven't talked about this very much, but by the time you're putting together your research paper, you need to have at least some idea of what the opposing viewpoint is, right? Eventually, we're going to be making arguments of our own, so we have to know what the opposing arguments are. What are the people saying on the other side of this? What are the counterpoints? What are the contrasting views? At some point, you have to respond to some of that. Again, that's part of your credibility. You have to show your audience that you've done your homework. You know all the different sides of the debate. You've read what other people have to say. And in some cases, you need to respond to them. So one way to do that, it's kind of a good way to do it actually, is to quote one of your opponents, somebody who disagrees with you, represents an opposing viewpoint. You can quote them and then respond to what they are saying in that quote. By doing this, you can sort of avoid the common accusation of twisting people's words or misquoting people, misunderstanding what they say. If you actually directly quote them and you do it accurately, and then you respond and say, okay, here's why you're wrong, here's why I disagree, that's a pretty good strategy because it's showing that you have read them, you have their source on hand, and you are quoting them accurately. And you still disagree. So you're not disagreeing because you're getting their words wrong. You disagree because you think their viewpoint is wrong. And that's, of course, an important distinction. So those are all good reasons to quote. Bad reasons to quote include the following. This quote is long and it looks like it will take up a lot of space. Of course, I'm joking, but that's not a joke. A lot of students do use that logic, and that is why they choose a lot of their quotes. So I don't mind some longer quotes, but typically you don't want to pick something just because it's long. And you don't want to pick something just because it's the first sentence that you come across or because you think it might be important, but you haven't really put a lot of thought into it. You need to put thought into your quotations. Why am I quoting this? Should I quote it? Should I paraphrase it? Or should I summarize it? You always have those three basic choices. So pick the right one. And when it comes to long quotes, just keep in mind, any direct quotation that ends up longer than 4 full lines of a paragraph, we consider those to be block quotes. Those are just long quotations. And they get formatted a little bit differently. I won't get into that just yet. But some of you might end up with block quotes. That's okay. On the research paper, though, I do have a maximum block quote amount. I don't want any more than 2, okay, because they do take up a lot of space. But they're okay if you want to quote maybe multiple sentences, maybe even a short paragraph that's just really good. You can't say it any better yourself. Yeah, you can go ahead and quote the whole thing, but let's not try to do really long quotes all the time because they take up space and too much space, and ultimately we want most of the language in our papers to be our own. Quoting is always effective when done right, but if we do it too much, it starts to sound like the paper's not yours. It's the sources. We want most of the language to be yours and a little bit of it to maybe come from the sources. All right, so now let's get into the nuts and bolts and the sort of mechanics of how we actually build our direct quotations. Because there are a lot of moving parts, and a lot of mistakes can occur if we're not doing this carefully and with a good attention to detail. So I want to introduce you to the concept known as the quote sandwich. And part of the material that I've sent this week is just a little Microsoft Word doc that shows you examples of what quote sandwiches look like. So this is very elementary, it's kind of silly, but it's an easy way to sort of visualize how to build a direct quotation. So if you think of quotes as sandwiches, you can start to identify the most important elements of a direct quotation. So just think about a sandwich, a very simple sandwich, okay? Boiling it down to its most essential elements, what do we have in a sandwich? We have a top slice of bread, we have a bottom slice of bread, and then we have some kind of meat or filling in the middle, okay? Let's keep it very simple. That's a sandwich. So let's think about those same three elements in relation to a direct quotation. So when we're building a quote sandwich, the top slice of bread is going to be our introduction to the quote. We have to introduce these quotes for multiple reasons. Part of it is the language isn't ours. So it can get confusing if we just switch back and forth without warning between our words and somebody else's words. We need to warn our audiences that we are doing that. We need to signal clearly what we are doing. And one way to accomplish that is to introduce the quote. Okay, so write that first. The top slice of bread is our introduction to the quote. And then the quote itself is, of course, the meat or the filling of the quote sandwich. So you can just plug the quote right into that middle section, and then the final element, the bottom slice of bread, that's going to be the explanation of the quote, or some kind of follow-up that you write after the quote. Okay, and you can see some examples that I've provided of top slices of bread and bottom slices of bread. So I'm showing you phrases and sentences that you can use for both. So it's a pretty simple structure. We introduce our quote, then we include the quote, obviously inside quotation marks. We can't forget that because the quotation marks make it clear that these are somebody else's words. Okay, so we have our top slice of bread, the quote itself, and then the bottom slice of bread. And if we can keep that structure in mind, we're going to have successful quote sandwiches. So a lot of those examples of top slices of bread are really simple phrases. As Lackey states. As Lackey says. Lackey makes the point at the end of the article that blank, right? These are just sort of simple phrases and sentences. Read through my examples and just replace the letter X with the name of your source. Because again, we often want to reference our source, name them, mention them by name when we are summarizing, paraphrasing, or quoting. So an easy way to do that is to provide the author's name in that introduction to the quote. Inside that top slice of bread, you can reference the author, identify the author, and then that leads us into the quote. So in some of my examples, I'm using short phrases as the top slice of bread, and then in other examples, I'm using complete sentences. Okay? Either method works, but you'll notice that we're using slightly different punctuation depending on how we're writing that top slice of bread. So if you're using a really simple phrase, like as Lackey states, if I'm your source, that could be a simple way to introduce the quote. So if you're using a phrase like that, all you need after the phrase and before the quote marks will be a comma. If you're using a short, simple phrase as your top slice of bread, you need a comma after the phrase and before the quote. But if you're using a complete sentence to introduce your quote, if you're using a complete sentence as that top slice of bread, and you can see a couple of examples in my document, I think the last two examples of top slices of bread are complete sentences. Okay, they have subjects, they have verbs, they express complete thoughts. So when I use complete sentences to introduce the quotes, I need a colon after the sentence and before the quote. Because a colon is a stronger punctuation sign than a comma. Just like a comma, it tells us to pause, but the pause is a little bit longer now because it comes after a complete sentence. Whereas we just need a very brief pause after a very short phrase. So just remember that. Short phrase, comma. Complete sentence, colon. That's the difference in punctuation if we're going to, based on whether we're using a phrase or a sentence as our top slice of bread. But either way, whether we're doing phrases or complete sentences, when we're doing quote sandwiches like those are called separated quotations. You don't have to memorize all of this, but it is kind of useful to think about. A separated quotation just means that the quote is separated from that first part of your sentence, the top slice of bread, the intro to the quote. The quote is separated from the rest of the sentence by punctuation, whether it be a comma or a colon. That's all that term means. But there's another way to do it. Separated quotes are fine, they're very common, but we can also do what's called an integrated quote. And I have some examples of those in the document as well. With an integrated quote, your quotation is truly integrated into the grammatical structure of your sentence, which means that you don't have to separate the quote from the rest of the sentence by punctuation. So if you look at the examples of integrated quotes, the key word is often that. So if you notice some of my examples that have the word that, if that is the final word before the quote, that's an integrated quotation. And you'll notice there's no punctuation after the word that, because that word seamlessly incorporates the quote into the rest of our sentence. So we can use other words to do that, but the word that, Lackey says that, and then we get into the quote. That's the most common way of doing an integrated quotation. It seems like a very subtle change, but it is different. Saying Lackey says that all students who study do better, right? That's integrated. The quote is just a part of my sentence now. Whereas if I use one of those shorter phrases and a comma, as Lackey says, comma, right? Now there's a separation, there's a pause, there's a transition, and I need that punctuation, and then I get into the quote. So just notice the subtle difference. It is subtle, but it's important, right? The word that and other similar words like by, in, so, to, a lot of these are prepositions. A lot of them can work to seamlessly kind of incorporate that quote into your sentence. And when we're doing it like that, we don't need punctuation to separate our top slice of bread from the quote. So just look at my examples. And one final rule to remember, if you have an integrated quote, you don't need to capitalize the first word of the quotation, even if it was capitalized in the original source. Even if it is a complete sentence, now it's a part of your other sentence, right? It's been organically integrated into your quote sandwich. So you don't have to capitalize it anymore because it's part of your grammatical structure if you're doing an integrated quote. But if you're doing a separated quote where you have the top slice followed by a comma or a colon and then the quote, in those cases you will typically if it's a complete sentence, you will typically capitalize the first word of the quotation because it's separate from the rest of your sentence. You've separated it by the punctuation, so now you have to maintain the original grammatical structure. Whereas with the integrated style, it's a part of your grammatical structure. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, look at my examples and you can see some of these subtle but important differences. So when you're doing quote sandwiches, you got to pay attention to punctuation. And you need to think a little bit about what style of top slice of bread you want. How do you want to introduce the quote? Do you want a short phrase? Do you want a complete sentence? Or do you want to try an integrated style where you can use a word like that to just seamlessly join everything together? So make some decisions and double check your work. Okay, now let's talk about the bottom slice of bread. And I want you to understand this. A good quote sandwich will typically consist of two separate sentences. Okay, the first sentence will consist of your top slice of bread, the quotation itself, and then the in-text citation that we have to provide after the quote. Okay, so we haven't really talked much about in-text citations, but they will become important for us. And whenever we're paraphrasing or quoting in our future work, we're going to have to provide in-text citations. That's the other level of MLA citation rules. We've already seen with our bibliographies, we've already seen with works cited pages, the works cited citation. But the in-text citation is the other level of citation. Those are the smaller citations that appear in the body of your essays. So after a direct quote, we have to include the in-text citation. And after that in-text citation, which is also called a parenthetical citation because the info is contained within parentheses, once we finish that citation, we end the first sentence. We put our period after the in-text citation. Okay, so we have our top slice of bread, the quote, and then the in-text citation. That's our first sentence. And then our second sentence will consist of our bottom slice of bread. So this is important when it comes to organization and just the overall presentation of your paper. If you make your quote sandwich two separate sentences, you will avoid a lot of punctuation mistakes, a lot of lack of clarity, because if you try to jam all of this stuff into one long sentence, it can often get confusing. It can be incorrectly punctuated. It can be difficult to read. So I always recommend that when you get to your bottom slice of bread, start a new sentence. And if you look at my examples of the bottom slice, you'll notice that all of my examples are the beginnings of new sentences. Okay, so what are we doing in that bottom slice? Well, sometimes we'll have to explain the quote that we just provided in the previous sentence. If we don't think the quote is going to be self-explanatory, we need to add a little bit more detail, we need to explain some things, we can do that in the bottom slice of bread. But then, in some cases, we might not think that the quote really needs to be explained anymore. Instead, we might decide that we need to follow up on it. We need to do something with the quote. We need to use it to make a point of our own. We need to use it as evidence for a point that we've already made. We need to use it as a transition, a way to move from one idea to the next. We need to use it to represent an opposing viewpoint, something. We need to comment on it, talk about it, do something with it. And that's what we can start to do in that bottom slice of bread. So it doesn't matter what you need to do. Explain, follow up, use it in a really direct way. The bottom slice of bread just gets you going in that direction. Okay, but again, that bottom slice of bread needs to be a separate, standalone sentence. So when students don't use quote sandwiches, we have a term for that. A lot of English teachers refer to that practice of just sort of dropping quotes in with no intro, no explanation. We call that quote bombing. That's just when people drop quotes in. There's no warning, no attempt to contextualize the quote, no attempt to really do anything with the quote. And that's when we know that the student is really just using the quote to take up space, or they think they have to have a certain number of quotes, so they're just grabbing sentences at random and quoting them. That's not effective, though. That's not going to help your research paper. All of your quotes need to be chosen deliberately, use good judgment, and it also needs to be clear to your readers why the quote is there. I should never be confused about why you chose that quote. It needs to directly tie into what you are doing in the larger paper. So make sure you're always doing stuff with your quotes. Don't just drop them in and walk away. Make sure you're using them in some kind of practical way. All right, so I think that's enough for today. Let's just start practicing. So like I said, once you have at least one source that you think you could potentially use in the future on the research paper, just go through it and find some sentences or maybe even some paragraphs that you would like to paraphrase and directly quote. Practice makes perfect. Our next major assignment, the rhetorical analysis, will give us a chance to practice all of these skills a little bit more. Summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. But you can do a little bit more of this week if you're looking at some of your sources. And in fact, our next research journal will just be a sort of informal way to practice paraphrasing and quoting in particular. So find a source, write me a brief summary of that source, and while you're doing that, you can paraphrase and quote just to show me that you're getting comfortable with these skills. So if you have questions, get those to me. Otherwise, I will see you next week as we start to really get moving on the rhetorical analysis assignment.